This is Dr. Chris Robertson providing an overview to implementation science. With respect to the DNP project proposal, implementation science is particularly applicable in the methodology, implementation, and anticipated limitation sections. Implementation science will impact the decisions that you make with regards to the procedures around your intervention. How you will do certain things will be influenced by the information you gather from implementation science and from your SWOT analysis. And so obviously that impacts the actual implementation. Methodology is how you plan to do it. Implementation is how you actually do it. And then speaking to the anticipated limitations, while also acknowledging the strengths of the proposal, these things come from and stem from issues related to implementation. Planning the methodology, planning the procedures, planning implementation without giving thought to the science and the art of implementation. How do I implement? And the many factors that you have to take into consideration it can be self-sabotage. So what is implementation science? A number of definitions. You also hear it called dissemination science or health services research. So I'll provide these here so that everyone has an opportunity to see and perhaps gain an understanding depending on how you better learn. So essentially, implementation science aims to identify best practice approaches in a variety of healthcare settings with the ultimate goal of improving outcomes. Sounds very much like research translation. And it studies the methods that promote the integration of research findings and evidence into healthcare policy and practice. So in other words, there's a way to integrate the findings into practice. There's a way to translate evidence into practice or evidence into policy. And part of that involves understanding healthcare providers and other stakeholders as variables in how interventions and innovations are adopted and how they're implemented. And the intent is to investigate and obviously identify and address any major bottlenecks or any barriers that impede effective implementation. And obviously with implementation science, there are theories that focus on dynamics that occur within complex organizational dimensions, because these are dynamics that you need to at least acknowledge when you see them and understand how, when, if it's going to affect the implementation of your project. And so again, implementation is the bridge between research and practice. But even with implementation, there's an art and there's a science to it. So some of the terms that you may see used are knowledge translation, knowledge transfer, the definitions of which are here and you can read through them yourself. Knowledge exchange, synthesis, and research utilization. There's also implementation, dissemination, and diffusion. There's some distinction that will be made shortly between diffusion and dissemination. Now, when it comes to implementation science, as many other topics that you studied throughout the program, there are a number of theories and frameworks. And so I want to share some with you. One of the more well-known theories is Rogers' theory of diffusion of innovation. Rogers speaks to 5 steps between innovation and decision and looks at it as a process. So it starts out with knowledge. The second step is persuasion. Third step, decision. With decision, you see that there are options where you either adopt or you reject. If you are, then you're going to actually implement. And confirmation is when you continue and sustain that adoption. And obviously, when you get back to step 3, when the decision is made to reject it, then obviously you would discontinue or continued rejection, or it may be that it's rejected and then it comes back later and it's adopted. And so when you also consider Rogers' theory of diffusions, one of the things that he pointed out is the need to recognize that within organizations, the people within organizations, but also organizations themselves, can fall within one of 5 categories. You have innovators, you have early adopters, you have the early majority, the late majority, and laggards. And these categories speak to the speed, so to speak, at which the individual or the organization may adopt the innovation. And diffusion itself is the process by which the innovation is communicated through channels over time among member organization. This is a very informal process and is different from dissemination, which we will define a little bit later. And let's go back to this slide. So keep in mind, even when it comes to you going to the site and sharing about the intervention that you're considering or that you're aiming to implement, you have some people who will jump on board immediately and want to support it. And again, those are your innovators, and you may have some who you already get the sense they're going to stay as far away from it as possible, and those are your laggards. And it's important to understand those dynamics. Hopefully those persons who are more innovators and early adopters are the persons who are in strategic positions to help support and push project implementation. Another theory is Grahl and Grimshaw, and they speak to the need to understand the approach or consider the approach, because that determines the implementation plan. And so I think this also goes back to considering the environment. If you're dealing with a change approach in an educational environment, you may need to assume that there's internal motivation to improve. And so the strategy must convey ownership of the change process. And in this type of environment, you'll see much more committee type decisions, more voting type decisions or whatnot. And so it speaks to the various approaches and the strategies that are associated with those approaches. So you see epidemiological, you see a marketing approach, and notice that even with the marketing approach, it talks to how the strategy must adapt the message to the needs of the target group and seeks to provide an attractive message. Some of these various approaches that it speaks to, even behavioral, where it talks about how human behavior can be influenced. So the strategy includes providing feedback and incentives or sanctions. You may find yourself intermingling some of these approaches as you engage and interact with some of the key players at the site. Because as you share about your innovation, obviously you want to present it in an attractive manner, target it to the group that you have to get approval from or what have you. You also want to speak to some of the incentives or some of the sanctions that may be avoided. You also want to speak to the evidence that's behind it and the strength and the quality of the evidence. And so again, you'll see how you intermingle and overlap some of these various approaches. The remaining approaches speak to social influence. And again, this is important even when you consider the previous theory, Roger, where he talked about the innovators and the laggards and the early adopters and the late adopters and whatnot. Social influence and how things are communicated and channeled within an organization with opinion leaders and champions is very important, and it's a dynamic to realize that it exists, but also to understand and recognize the persons who may be the opinion leaders and who may be the champions. And you also see the organizational and the coercive approach. So moving on, we have Greenhall's diffusion of innovations model in human services. This is a very comprehensive and extensive model with respect to diffusion of innovations. and it will be detailed in a separate seminar, so I won't go into a lot of it here. However, you can see that there are various components and there are subcomponents that are listed that speak to considerations to be given. So, for example, when you're looking at the innovation, you have to think about its relative advantage, how complex it is. Can it actually be piloted and trialed? What are its risks and benefits? And do the benefits outweigh the risk? What are the task issues? How much time is it going to require? How much work and effort is it going to require of the people that you're looking to engage? So those are things and characteristics of the innovation that you can take into consideration, because it is going to affect how that innovation is essentially implemented, and it's going to affect how that innovation diffuses throughout the organization or diffuses throughout that clinical setting or that clinical practice team or unit that you're going to be working with. So here's the Haynes and Jones translation model. Here you can see at the top where they start with a type of research activity, or they're doing research activity, obviously generate findings that then contribute towards systematic reviews, and therefore resulting in evidence of effectiveness. So you have this evidence that shows this particular intervention works. And there you can see how you've got professional organizations and educational bodies, patients, policymakers, healthcare providers, purchasers or whatnot, who are setting priorities and developing and implementing guidelines and practice with respect to evidence that has basically come down the pipeline. And so again, this speaks to how research is translated into practice, but it also reflects implementation science. And you see this particular model demonstrates several connections with regards to the interchanges and relationships between these various, if you want to say, entities at the bottom, and how they interact with each other. And it's important as you move forward to understand how policymakers have an impact on patients and the public, as well as the professional organizations. There's so many lines that could be drawn here: how policymakers impact healthcare providers, how healthcare providers impact policymakers, so on and so forth. Again, that's important because depending on who your intervention targets, who it involves, and where your applications lie, it's very important to understand and recognize these dynamics where they occur. Glasgow and Emmons implementation model. They asked the question, how can we increase translation of research into practice? This has been a difficult slide for me to view, so in later slides, this is actually pulled out in more detail one by one so that we can see it better. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. But with this question, again, it stems from the fact that prior research has shown that it takes 17 years for evidence to be implemented into practice. That's a long time. So in this implementation model, beginning to look at some of the barriers and acknowledge them and consider what should be done about them. Another model is the Ottawa model of research. And this one, again, assesses barriers and supports. It's very important to identify the supports because sometimes you can take those supports and actually leverage them to address barriers. And so you do that prior to implementation and during implementation. And during implementation, you also want to monitor the intervention and the degree of its use. In other words, that goes back to intervention fidelity. So you want to look at if an intervention has, let's just say 10 components, let's say it's a checklist of 10 items. And so if all 10 items are performed over the course project, then that would be considered full implementation. Let's keep it simple. However, if only 5 of the 10 things were done, then that would be considered 50% implementation, or whatever measure it would be assigned. And so sometimes you would have participants who may only be exposed to varying degrees of the intervention. And so with regards to how measurement occurs and when you're looking at outcomes, you want to take that into consideration, because the outcome you get with someone who received the full measure of the intervention may be very different from someone who did not. And so again, monitoring the intervention and the degree of its use, and they're evaluating the outcomes. And the outcomes with respect to the patient population, the outcomes with respect to your healthcare provider, as well as the system. One of the things that you cannot omit is what is the involvement of the healthcare provider. Even in studies and projects that require staff to get a weight on participants, you want to make sure that obviously they are aware of proper technique to obtain weights or to obtain blood pressures. And this is where, from a planning standpoint, with respect to implementation and measurement error, you would want to make sure that there is some type of training or support or whatnot. But again, consider your barriers and support, monitor your intervention and degree of use, and evaluate your outcomes. The knowledge to action model. So in the center, you've got knowledge inquiry, knowledge synthesis, knowledge tools, and products. And so you see here you've got cycle starting point, and where you identify the problem and you identify, review, and select knowledge. Again, the inquiry, synthesis, and looking at knowledge tools and products. From there, you adopt the knowledge to local content. So let's look at this knowledge and see what's the same, what's different as it relates to what's in the literature and what I actually see in practice. Assessing barriers to use this knowledge. I want to implement this particular evidence, this body of evidence. And so what are the challenges that it looks like I'm going to face? And again, how will you know that unless you do an analysis of the environment, a SWOT analysis? And that's what the purpose of your SWOT analysis is. And because you assess the environment to see the challenges, where is there fit, where is there not, then you're able to tailor the intervention for implementation so that it will be more applicable and more feasible with regard to the core components, maintaining those things, and things that where you may have flexibility, changing those and modifying it to be a better fit. And obviously monitoring use of knowledge. And here where it says knowledge, think evidence. So monitoring the use of the evidence, how the evidence is being translated into practice, evaluating outcomes. And one thing about this particular model is that it speaks to sustaining knowledge use, which is so important with respect to implementation science. So with implementation science, you want to consider culture. It's ideal to have a culture that promotes translation. It's good to have champions and mentors and leaders and technical resources. You want to consider the norms and the values and the basic assumptions of an organization. What are their underlying beliefs and values? And are there values and beliefs that need to be transformed for change to be sustainable? You also want to consider the climate with regards to leadership style and communication channels and teamwork, and consider the organizational goals. Are they clear? Are they measurable, consensual? With the competing values framework, I put this up here not for you to be able to explain this or understand at a quick glance, but I want you to understand, and the biggest takeaway is that organizations will have competing values. And as you go in to do your SWOT analysis assignment, but also as you continue to work with the site over the course of the semester and planning your project, you want to be able to identify what their values are and recognize that sometimes they do have competing values. The upper left speaks to a value that is more collaborative. Are they focused on doing things that last? So when it comes to their people, their practice, and their purpose, what types of things and what types of values will you tend to see in that setting? And in the upper right, do they value doing things first? And if that's the case, then you're going to see more creativity and what is considered here in this instance to be an open system. And again, you see some of the values listed here with regards to people, purpose, and practice. The lower right speaks to values that are aligned more so with competing and being competitive and wanting to do things fast. And so here, their goals may be more rational with respect to what you may see there. They value more short-term performance. And then in the lower left, you see if they value doing things right, then one of their values may be more of control. And so there's more emphasis on internal processes and more focus on incremental changes. And this is essentially the same type competing values framework. However, it is presented a little bit differently. So again, when you look at the upper left, that speaks to collaborative and doing things that last, and it speaks to more of long-term development and focus on human relations. You can see here where it talks about the mentor and the facilitator and the human relation model. And so you may need to leverage more around the issue of building a team and using participative, decision making, managing conflict where you need to, making sure that there's understanding and communication and an opportunity for subordinates to be developed. And so again, when you look at the upper right, the creativity, focusing on doing things first and breakthrough, you've got your innovators and your brokers and more of an open system model. And looking at the lower right, and doing things fast, short-term performance, more competitive. You've got your producers and your directors, more of a rational goal model. Got to make sense, particularly from a financial standpoint. And looking at the lower left, the control, more value on control, more value on doing things right, internal processes, more incremental change. You got more coordination, monitoring. And so again, understand what organizations value. And that's not always something that will be stated, but through your observation and interaction, you can certainly garner that information. With respect to any barriers, you want to identify those as much as possible prior to you actually translating, prior to you actually implementing. You want to identify those barriers and prioritize. Is it modifiable? Is it mission critical? And how am I going to address it? So when you identify challenges, granted, you could go through and identify 100, but 100 is not realistic or feasible that you're going to be able to address. So again, which ones are mission critical? And you also want to consider implementation models that allow that opportunity to address barriers. Look at your adopter characteristics. Look at facilitators. Consider knowledge and skills and their awareness of evidence and their willingness to change. Consider organizational characteristics. Who actually has authority to make changes? It's one thing to speak with someone who, supports your project, but if they don't have the authority to make changes, then you may not go as far as you would like. And again, looking at administrative support for implementation facilities and actually having time from whatever resources you need, particularly staff, for implementation. and looking at the various characteristics of the innovation. Some of the barriers to dissemination and translation are listed here. You can read through these. I'm not going to go through them. Some of them make absolute sense. High cost, intense demands. These are going to be barriers. And so when you go into your sites, you're not going to go in with something that's going to cost a lot or require a lot of time from staff, because it's time that they probably don't already have. And this goes back to the model that we saw earlier, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Glasgow and Emmons implementation model. And so all of these items are listed here. The first, the intervention characteristics. And so again, you've also got barriers that are related to the situation of the intended target settings, competing demands. We discussed a little bit about that. Programs imposed from the outside, financial and organizational stability, limited resources, limited time. This list could be much, much more extensive, but it begins to give you an idea. Also, consider research design. If you're not evaluating what is important to them, then you may not get the buy-in and the support. If literature says this is the outcome of interest, however, when you talk to the site, they acknowledge and say they get that, no problem, but they'd also want to see you evaluate another outcome. It may or may not be, it doesn't have to be a primary outcome, it may be secondary. And it's within reason to evaluate it because it is of interest to them and it is related. And so again, if you choose not to, you're not evaluating what they have interest in, and that may be a barrier. So consider those elements of research design. You may not understand research design, but there are some components that you want to make sure you address and that there's some understanding. And when you think about the type of barrier types and the interactions, what can happen? You have interventions that are not flexible, the program reach or participation becomes low. The intervention may not be appropriate for the target population. Staffing pattern doesn't match the intervention needs. There are a number of issues that can, and so instead of finding yourself on that end, consider this ahead of time and try to address. And that's why you have a semester to figure out your methods and how you're going to implement, because it gives you that time to put together your plan, consult with the site, make adjustments together, and finalize things with your committee as well as the practice site. And the bottom line is, with implementation science, the biggest takeaway is that you address barriers. You prioritize those barriers. You go back and you see, how am I going to implement, which is essentially, how am I going to translate this evidence into practice? And you choose an implementation science model that is going to support you in doing that. And you develop appropriate interventions to address the barriers that you identify. This concludes the lecture on implementation science.